What's going on, everyone? I hope you're well. I know there's been a little bit of a break from the channel. I've been in Vegas end of last year for the WSOP. Ended up playing a lot more than I was planning on and anticipating, which as a result ended up not producing as much content as I was planning on. But hey, that's how it goes sometimes. Unfortunately, no big results or any brags from Vegas, but it was nice to play live again for after such a long break. And to be honest, I was a little bit nervous when I first sat down because I hadn't played a hand of live poker in over 2 years, so I wasn't sure how I was going to react. The longest break I had before that was, I think, 20 days. So huge difference, obviously, in the time off. So I felt a little bit rusty in my first tournament, but then I got into it really quickly, I would say, and it was, it's kind of like getting on a bike. When you've been playing professionally for as many years as I have now, you're getting back into things rather quickly. And of course, like even during COVID, I've been playing tons of online, so I felt pretty good about my game overall, and I was excited to implement the strategies and the studies that I've worked on in the last 2 years during lockdowns and whatnot, and to try those new strategies in live poker, which is, to be honest, really where the value is at. Like, it's a complete different game after battling with the toughest players online for the last 2 years. To be able to sit down at a table and play a $5,000 or $10,000 buy-in tournament where you don't recognize anyone or maybe just one player, it's really, yeah, it's really amazing. So yeah, Vegas was fun, very exhausting though, so I had to take a little break coming back from it. But now I'm ready to get back to business. So my plan for the immediate future is to ramp up the YouTube content. And I thought to kick things off again and to really restart the channel, I thought I was going to do something that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and that is breaking down a tournament I played from start to finish. And my last big deep run that I had in a major online event was the 10K Scoop of last year. Spring Championship of Online Poker, one of the biggest online series in the world. And this is, as you can see, the main event. Even though this tournament took place, 6-7 months ago now, and I don't remember all the hands, I remember that there was a lot of interesting spots. And yeah, I can't wait to break this down. So that's enough of me rambling. Let's get into it and check out the action. So the way I'm going to structure this is I'm just going to let it run. So I'm not going to skip any hands. I know the more popular format is that you're only going through the hands that you VPIP, meaning the hands that you play, because obviously they're more interested. No one wants to see you fold a bunch, but I think it's important to show the hands that are being dealt and folded, and also to see what the action is, just to get a more realistic approach of like how a tournament is actually played. Because I think when you're only showing the hands that you play, you provide the viewers with a pretty unrealistic picture of what tournament poker is actually like. There is a lot of folding and there's a lot of spots that you got to pass up on. That being said, I'm going to pause the action and go through hands that I think are particularly interesting. Go back a little bit here. Yeah, it was this hand. So here, obviously, big pot pre-flop gets cold 4-bet by the big blind, who's Daniel DeVoris. And yeah, so let's start, as always, to break down the ranges here. So we got an opening from under the gun. That's weird. I thought this was an 800 tournament, but I guess not. Anyway, it gets 3-bet by the mid position, which should be a pretty tight range, obviously, facing that tight under the gun open. And then it gets cold 4-bet by Daniel in the big blind. And this should be an extremely tight range. I would say that Daniel's range here is probably aces, kings, maybe queens, even though I wouldn't be thrilled to get in queens here, given the positions and the early stage of the tournament. I did late register this a little bit, so we're actually not, it's not like this is the first few hands of the tournament. As you can see, the blinds are 3K and we start with 250K. So I probably jumped in about 1 hour or 2 hours late, so that's worth pointing out. But nevertheless, they're still quite deep, and with ranges this tight, I think Daniel should have, yeah, aces, kings, and queens for value, mixed in with a low frequency bluffs, which would come from probably like the small aces, I would say, like ace five, ace four, suited, of course, but not all of the time, just a small frequency of those, just to balance his value range. But you should definitely not have many bluffs here or be looser than, I would say, queens for value. And mid position calls. Now I would say the ranges are pretty defined, at least for mid position. He should probably call his entire range here pre-flop. There's not much point in putting it in with aces or kings or queens or even jacks pre-flop, because he's either way ahead or way behind. And you want to balance the calling range, of course. And with stacks this shallow, it's not going to be difficult to stack off on pretty much any flop if you have aces or kings. So anyway, Daniel continuation bets about 30% on this board, which should be pretty damn strong. And he gets put in, calls it up. Not too surprising there. And we go to showdown. And Daniel has queens, which is, I would say, bottom of his value range. And his opponent happens to have the ace-7 offsuit, which is, pretty ambitious and not very good. Yeah. So bit of a punt there, early stage of a 10K online event. Not something you see every day. So we're taking note there. So let's continue. Oh, that was the same hand. We are. I was going to say, wow, they play another big pot right after, but if I remember correctly, I haven't watched this, by the way, but if I remember correctly, I didn't play many hands early on. But then there was a stretch where I played a lot of hands, like consecutively, so there will be action coming soon. All right, here we go. Surely I'm playing this hand. Yeah. Okay, so ace queen here, facing a limp from the small blind. Obviously, there's only one option for us, and that's to put in an ISO raise. And with the small blind being this short and our effective stack size being 27 big blinds, I think it's enough to put in a 3x raise here rather than a full 4x. I would go 4x if stacks were, if the small blind had a bigger stack, 30, 40, I would say 40 big blinds or more, I'll put in the 4x. But with 30, I think 3x is plenty. Gets the job done. And yeah, we get the king for a 3 flop. Obviously, pretty good flop for us. There's a lot of hands that we can have that the small blind simply doesn't have. He doesn't have sets. He doesn't have many 2 pairs. He wouldn't limp call a hand like king 4 or king 3, at least not offsuit. Suited probably yes, but with the board being two-tone, there's really not that many combinations of the suited 2 pairs. And also, he doesn't have the best kings that I do. Like, he doesn't have ace king or king queen, because they'll get the money in pre-flop one way or another. I'm also blocking king queen for what it's worth, but nevertheless, it's pretty easy c-bet for me with my entire range. Because it's such a good board for me and I want to force folds from my opponent's range, I think I should go fairly big here. I ended up going 30%, which I think is fine, but it should be probably the smallest size I use here. I like to lean towards like a 40 or 50 or 60% c-bet here. I don't think I need to go bigger than that because stacks are so shallow, so that will get the job done anyway. The reason for going bigger here rather than small is because we want to put maximum pressure on our opponent, force out folds from backdoor draws, ace highs. Although he shouldn't have many ace highs, he should be limp raising those pre-flop. But regardless, we want to put max pressure on like bottom pairs, stuff with backdoor equity and potential. Because if we bet big here with our entire range, then we're really disincentivizing him from potentially check raising with those draws and putting us in a tough spot or forcing us to fold even the best hand. But when we're betting small, we're giving him a lot more rope to continue with those holdings. But yeah, I think this is fine and gets the job done. All right, back-to-back hands. So here with eights, you can see we're pretty deep versus the big blind. So with the stack depth, my default strategy is usually to limp my entire range that I'm playing. Obviously, I'm not limping 100% of hands here. I'm still open folding some, so I'm open folding the real junk, like the 10-3 offsuits and worse hands than that. But everything else, I start with a limp, and I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. But the main one is to be able to VPIP more hands, and because if you're having an aggressive racing strategy of this stack depth, you can really end up in a lot of trouble and a lot of tricky situations, because it's very hard to navigate once you get 3-bet or when you get floated, and then you're just bloating a pot with too many combinations out of position. And with really wide ranges, it can be really tricky to know where you're at on a lot of boards, even when you have the incentive. So I rather, it's like it's a defensive strategy, but it's kind of cool because you use your defense to your advantage. So since I'm limping my entire range that I'm electing to continue with here, sure, I'm not going to have that many strong hands, but I'll still be completely uncapped. So I'll still have aces and kings and ace king in my range. So it's not like my opponent can go bananas here and start racing any two, because he still has to be worried about potentially getting limp raised. So yeah, not surprised to see me limp here. And Daniel does go ahead and ISO. So now it's back to us, and we need to decide whether we want to limp raise or limp call. And with eights here, I think it's very borderline, very close between the two options. I can see a good merit for both. Obviously, limp calling eights here looks a little bit passive. But on the flip side, if we limp raise here and get floated or potentially 4-bet, we really not liking it that much. So we're not gonna, if we get, obviously we will get called more than 4-bet, but we're not gonna like a lot of boards. And now we're built a huge pot that we're gonna have to navigate out of position versus an elite opponent. And that's never fun with pocket eights, because there's not gonna be many boards that are all low cards or has an 8 on them. So it can be pretty tricky to play, especially with wide ranges. So I think my default play here is just to limp call in this situation, but it's also very opponent dependent, because I don't think limp racing here and folding to a potential 4-bet is a good strategy, but I also don't think that limp racing and getting it in is that appealing. So it's kind of like, it's very player dependent, I would say. Versus like a crazy opponent, I'll probably lean towards trying to get it in or try to get as much money in as possible. But versus someone who's playing solid ranges and or maybe a little bit tighter, I would never really limp raise this type of holding. I would just try to pot control and try to see flop. So let's see. Yeah, I go with the call. And yeah, pretty good board, obviously, for our particular holding. And we get bet into pretty big. I think versus a smaller c-bet here, we could potentially explore the option of check raising our holding for thin value protection. But versus this bigger size, usually big sizes represent a pretty polarized range, meaning that he'll bet this big with either a really strong holding or a really weak one. And with eights here, it wouldn't really make much sense to check raise eights versus that type of range, because if he has a really strong hand, he has us beat. And if he has a really weak hand, we have him in probably pretty good shape. So yeah, I think our main option here should just be to call and try to realize our equity. That is what I do. On the jack turn, I didn't touch on leading, by the way. It's not something that I'm using a lot in my game, and I think if you're going to consider leading, you need to have a very good reason for doing so, and because it can really mess things up and complicate the game for you, which, you know, you always want to simplify your decision making because you're making so many decisions. So it's more important to make good ones than to make crazy creative plays that may or may not work, because it's very easy to end up leveling yourself and you think you have a good reason for it, and just ends up that, or it turns out that your theory is wrong, and it ends up costing you more than your potential gain. So I don't think this is a particularly good spot to lead. I don't think the jack changes that much. Sure, 10-8 gets there, but my opponent will have 10-8 in his range as well. The jack doesn't particularly improve any of my holdings. Sure, like jack 10, but I don't think it's a strong enough card for my range to justify a lead. So I do check, and Daniel checks behind. So what this tells me is now I'm pretty confident that my eights are most likely good. I don't think he checks back a 9 here that often, because the jack isn't exactly a scare card or anything, and a 9 here would most definitely be good a lot of the time. And he can get a lot of value from one pair and draw type of holdings. And he doesn't want to be, well, he doesn't want to let me realize my equity for free. So I'm pretty sure my hand is good. And there's also a lot of hands that I can exclude from his range. So he obviously not check back the turn here ever with a set or a 2 pair. Like, the board is just way too draw heavy for that. It wouldn't really make much sense. So I think his best potential holding here is probably a 9 that he's checking back sometimes, but not always. But obviously he's going to have a ton of give ups as well, because if we remember the flop sizing that he used, that usually represent a polarized range. So if he's not having, if he checks back the turn, he's obviously more inclined to have one of those air balls that is the bottom of his range that he uses to bet big on the flop. Yeah, and then we get the ace on the river. And I think initially this might look like a really bad card for us. But if we think about it from a deeper perspective, it's actually, I mean, obviously it's a bad card for our particular holding, but for our overall range, it actually, I would say, favors our range more than our opponent. And the reason for that is because we're going to check call a lot of ace highs and a lot of ace fours, ace sevens, possibly ace 9, ace jack for sure on the flop, where Daniel should be, I don't see him using that big size with ace 4 or ace 7 on the flop. And we know he doesn't have 2 pair. And so the only 2 pairs, we know he doesn't have 2 pair on the chart, rather. So the only 2 pairs he can have is really ace 9, which I don't think he checks back the turn with. So it's very difficult for him to have 2 pair. And with his naked aces, he should check back his smaller aces pre-flop, at least the offsuit ones, and then use those as bluff catchers rather. And with the big aces, like the ace kings, the ace queens, I'm not particularly sure that he uses that betting strategy with those type of holdings. I think he's, pretty inclined to check those back on the flop because they still have a lot of showdown value, a lot of equity, and they really don't want to get or open up the possibility of getting check raised on the flop and have to fold out all that equity. So overall, I think the ace is actually a deceivingly good card for our range, and it should keep our opponent pretty honest. That being said, we could potentially throw out a block bet here, but with my analysis of his range being pretty polarized, him having more air balls in his range than strong hands, and really not that many middling strong hands. So like, I don't think he has any, or at least many sevens or fours in his range. He shouldn't have many jacks either. Possibly he had a hand like jack 2 suited or jack 3 or whatever that got there on the turn and is now turning into a bluff catcher. But regardless, like, it doesn't make sense for us to block because we're only getting called by hands that beats us. I'm not sure if a 9 or a jack is value betting this river. I don't think so. So yeah, so I think we should just go ahead and check here and hope to show down our holding. Because block betting is only really effective if you're trying to squeeze either thin value or blocking your opponent from making a big bet. And I don't think either of those things applied here. I don't think he has many weak hands that can call, or if any, that would play this way, given the analysis leading up to the river. And yeah, I'm not too concerned about facing a massive bet here, because if I do, I think I'm just gonna have to fold this one, because I do have so many aces in my range. So it's not like my range isn't protected. So I go ahead and check, and pretty happy to see the check back. He happens to have king 9 though, which you know, doesn't really correlate with my analysis that he would check back that holding on the turn. I'm not sure if that's something he does all the time or not, but I would imagine not so, and that he's betting it most of the time because it's such a strong holding given the situation, even with the big flop bet. And he's just way ahead of my range, in my opinion. So it looks like we have another playable hand here, so I'm going to pause it and slow it down a bit. Faced with a under the gun open from Jason here, 10-8 off, 10-8 suited on the button. Might seem a little bit loose, but it's actually a very profitable call. Back in the day, I remember this used to be a very popular 3-bet candidate. You know, you have a hand that isn't ahead of any of villain's opening combinations. He's not opening worse 10s or 8s here. So there's not a lot of merit to flatting for those reasons. But the problem with 3-betting 10-8 here is that when we're facing such a tight opening range, we're more interested in using blocker heavy combinations. So hands that has either a king or an ace in them, things that are essentially blocking the strongest hands of our opponent's range, that would always continue and usually 4-bet, which prevents us from realizing our equity with our hand. So with a hand like this, we're more interested in trying to realize that equity in position. Yeah, sure, we're not dominating anything, but we still have a lot of playability, and we're also unblocking a lot of stuff. So there's a lot of live cards that are really good for us. So yeah, this definitely a call. And Daniel calls in the small blind as well, so we go 3-way to the flop. Daniel checks, and Jason bets this flop, which is a little bit surprising to me because at a glance, this looks like a pretty good board, both for my range, but especially the small blinds range. There's certain hands that Jason won't have here, like pocket deuces, for example, which I would expect. I mean, I know I have all of the sets here, and I would expect Daniel to have deuces as well. Not 100% sure about that, but because with the stack depths, you have to be a little bit wary about set mining the lowest pairs, because getting set over set is a real threat, and it can end up costing you your entire stack. It's really hard to get away when you flop a set, because usually plays as a check raise, and then all the money goes in sooner or later. So I'm not sure if he's flatting deuces and threes here, but we can definitely exclude those from Jason's range. I know for a fact he's not opening deuces here. And Jason's also going to have a lot of ace king off combinations, ace queen off combinations, which we won't have. So even though our range is wider, of course, we're flatting more combinations. It's more condensed to like the middling stuff. So stuff that connects pretty well with his board. So we'll have a lot of 8-9 suited with a backdoor, or even 10-7 suited. I would have not a ton of two pair, obviously, but a lot of all the sets, and a lot of tens as well. So I'm a little bit surprised to see Jason bet here, but nevertheless, I think I have a pretty standard call. If I had a better 10, if I had a better kicker, I would definitely consider racing for protection, even versus a tight range. But with the 8 here, I'm not actually getting value from any worse 10s, because as I said, like obviously Jason doesn't have 10-6 in his range, and neither does Daniel. So that just loses a lot of merit for racing for protection, and I'd rather keep the pot at a reasonable size and just play my hand as a bluff catcher. Pretty good turn, obviously, picking up the open ender. And now I would definitely expect Jason to start checking. But he goes ahead and bet again. And not a huge bet by any means, but I'm very curious what his betting range looks like here. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably a lot of overpairs. Obviously, you can have most of the sets as well, and some two pairs. No straights really is available, and still a lot of draws. It's of course totally possible that he's just trying to squeeze some extra value from hands like 9-8, pocket eights, maybe 8-7 suited, those type of combinations. Hands that wouldn't bet if Jason checks. He's trying to get some value from those, but also will always call his bet. So he might be betting over pairs, and obviously the two pairs, the sets, and draws. But overall, I would really expect him to be more interested in having a really high checking frequency on this run out. Yeah, from my perspective, I think a pretty clear call again. Racing with this combination doesn't really make much sense. More interested in keeping his bluffs in play, and obviously we're not really beating anything. So like the only reason for, and we're not gonna get action from anything worse. So the only reason for racing here would be to do it for protection. Where, yeah, I mean, we're still gonna get it in versus, Queen Jack of clubs or King Queen of clubs, King Jack of clubs, like those type of combinations. I can't really see them bet folding this turn with so much equity. So that's pretty much like best case scenario. And then sure, yeah, we can fold out maybe ace 5 of clubs if we put in a big race here, putting him in a pretty awkward spot where we're not giving him the right price to continue because we're representing such a tight range. But that's pretty much the only benefit. So I think there's more merit to just calling here and keeping the pot at a reasonable size. This is a pretty comfortable call, obviously. Like we're not being put in a super tough spot. Had Jason bet like 2x pot here, obviously we were still calling, but then it starts getting a little bit dicey because as you can see, our stack depth isn't super deep. So yeah, pretty happy to call here and take a river. And we do get there on the river. And now Jason starts checking. So now we gotta ask yourself, how much value can we squeeze out of him here? What does our range look like at this point? And if we think about what our perceived or our assumption of his range on the turn with his betting strategy. Um, what what sort of hands are we targeting here with our value bet, and how big can we go? Because that's what we want to know, right? That we want to try to figure out how we can squeeze as much value as possible while still staying somewhat balanced. So if we start by asking ourselves, what are our bluffs here? What bluffs do we get to on the river here, the way the hand played out? And as you can imagine, or if you think about it, it's very difficult for us to have a pure bluff here. Like what bluffs calls the C bet with a player behind, calls the turn bet, the 70% turn bet, and are now not either one pair or better. Very few. It's virtually impossible for us to have a bluff here that's not a pair. So if the bottom of our range is a pair, and we think our opponent he's not capped, but he has a lot of middling strong hands. So I think when he bets that turn, I think he has a lot of aces, kings, maybe queens that are trying to target my one pair and draw type of holdings, or maybe a 10, maybe the queen 10 or jack 10s. He's trying to target those hands by betting the turn there because he thinks that I'm likely to check back those holdings. So if that's my, and then he obviously has those missed draws, and he has the strong stuff. So like the sets, the 10s, the 9s, the 10-9, the jack 10. Those maybe it's not betting jack 10 on the turn as much. It could be. It's just for, it's a top pair gutter, and he wants to bet that for protection to fold out worse and also get called by some weaker hands. Like basically the same type of stuff that would target with the queens, kings, and aces bets. So if that's his range, then what do I want to do with my range? If my range is one pair or better. So obviously I'm gonna have a ton of value bets here. I'm gonna have a lot of eights. I'm gonna have a lot of sets. Do I want to bet two pairs for value? It starts to get a little bit dicey because I would expect him to check some sets here as well. At least it's the lower sets and the stuff that doesn't block calls. Obviously, it's possible for him to have a straight here as well, although I think he would be more inclined to bet a straight just because my range is so strong and I have so many hands that, like two pair type combinations or even top pairs, that aren't going to value bet this river with the four straight out there. So I think he really wants to put in the value bet himself most of the time, rather than trying to make me turn a one pair type holding like a queen 10, for example, into a massive bluff. But it is something to be at least aware of, that he could have a straight himself. And obviously he's going to have a lot of sets as well. So the main category of hands that I'm looking to fold out when I'm bluffing would be stronger one pair hands that beats me, right? So the aces, the kings, the queens, the queen jacks, the ace 10, stuff that he could pretty likely to bet the turn with, but would check the river. And so you always have to like rewind and see, remember what happened. Obviously, like take opening ranges in consideration, and then based on the action on the flop and the turn, you're constantly shrinking your opponent's range. And then by doing so, you're boiling it down to a very condensed range on the river, which makes the game way easier to play and makes it much easier to make good, accurate decisions. So if I'm targeting those type of holdings, like the really strong pairs, I definitely want to use a very large size, because I also want to use a very large size when I have a straight. And with 150% pot left to play on the river, I think I should elect to go all in with my value bets and my bluffs. And I don't think I should value bet that light, meaning I shouldn't value bet a lot of the two pairs. So let's see what I do here. I end up going with the 70% bet, which, I mean, I get what I'm trying to achieve here. Like I'm obviously trying to maximize the amount of times I get called. I'm not sure how balanced my strategy is here, to be honest, and it definitely should be versus someone as good as Jason. Like I'm not trying to exploit him in any way, but I think during the time, if I remember correctly, I was just thinking that I I want to use one size here, and I'm always, you know, I don't need to go bigger because I have so many value bets in my range, and it's really tough for me to get called as well. So if I want to value bet sets in two pairs here, I pretty much have to use this size. And if I'm not interested in splitting my sizes, meaning that I have one size, let's say I have an all-in size for my bluffs or most of my bluffs and my straights, which would make sense, a very polarized betting strategy there, then I could choose this sizing for hands that aren't as strong. And so hands like two pairs and sets, and also obviously some straights and some bluffs. But I think I might have overcomplicated this situation a little bit, and I think I should just limit myself to one size, not value bet as wide, not value bet the two pairs, and yeah, just use the all-in size for my entire range. Anyway, it didn't work. Yeah, we'll never know what he had there. Bit of a breather here. Not a ton of action. Probably pausing the first part pretty soon. Let's see if we play this. Nope. Surely. Okay. So here's the spot. Yeah, so cutoff opens. Again, short stack. Same opponent as when we had the ace queen. Is now a little bit shorter. And with king 10 off here, definitely a playable hand. We can obviously elect to 3-bet this some of the time as well. But I think the main thing here is to think about is positions, right? So think about the cutoff's opening range. Similar to the 10-8 suited hand we had on the button before in the previous orbit, I think this used to be a very high 3-bet combination in this situation. But there's a few reasons why I favor call over 3-betting here. And the main one being that we're actually, versus the cutoffs range, we're actually dominating more hands than you might think. Because in general, when you look down at King 10, you're like, oh yeah, this doesn't play very well. Post flop, it doesn't dominate a lot of the hands. I can fold out. But in this scenario, we're actually dominating a lot of hands in our opponent's range because the cutoff should be opening a lot of worse kings here and a lot of worse tens, especially the suited portion. So by 3-betting here, we're folding out all of the worst kings and tens that we're currently dominating, and we're not actually generating that many folds from better. Like he's not folding. He's not folding ace 10 suited here, and maybe not even ace 10 off. I don't think so. So we're actually not accomplishing that much by 3-betting this combination. We're actually more interested in keeping the worst kings and tens in his range, especially given that we have position. Obviously, it wouldn't be a mistake to 3-bet this combination. I would certainly like to do it some portion of the time, but I think I would prefer to do it versus a mid position open because that range is not as wide as the cutoff by any means. And you also get a lot more credibility. That's another issue by 3-betting here. 3-betting here is not generating that many folds just because of the position. So like we're supposed to be quite aggressive here on the bottom versus such a wide range. So you get into this leveling war and metagame where they're expanding their 4-betting range because of it. So it's not going to be as effective. I think this is a deceivingly bad flop for us. It looks like a good one. I think usually when we're out of position and we're getting called and we're faced with a queen high board, we tend to check that board because our opponent should have a lot more queens in his range than we do. But if, in this instance, actually, I don't think that's true. If we think about it, we don't have any sets, any two pairs, and not a whole lot of queens. So not a lot of top pairs. Like ace queen, we would certainly get in pre-flop. King queen probably getting in as well. Queen jack, sure, and queen 10, queen 9, some worse suited queens, but not a ton of combinations overall. And that's the issue. That our range here is quite capped. Our opponent's range is not. He still has all of the sets, all the overpairs, all of the top pairs, top kickers, stuff that we simply don't have. So we basically cap to a weaker queen and flush draws that would certainly getting it in of the stack depth if we like to bet. But our range is overall pretty vulnerable. That being said, there are, of course, some merit to betting here. Betting a hand like King 10 here can fold out a fair amount of ace-x combinations, like a hand like ace-5 of spades would be pretty tough to defend versus a bet here. Yeah, but like we're not folding out any better kings. Like King Jack, obviously, always continuing with the backdoors and the high card equities. So yeah, I think I would prefer to check here, but yeah, I do like to bet. I bet 40%, which I think is fine. If I gonna bet, I want to bet that size just to target his ace highs. If I bet smaller, I'm making it way too easy for him to continue with his ace highs, and he's kind of forced to do so. So betting small here is not a good idea. We want to bet decently big. This might not look like a big bet because it's 40% pot, but all things considered, given that our opponent only has 3x pot behind, it's actually a pretty significant sized bet. So we'll have the same effect. We don't need to go bigger than this. And we do get punished for it, unfortunately. And yeah, we don't get to realize our equity. I mean, we're probably behind anyway, but we'll never know. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap up part 1 here. I would love to hear your feedback in the comment section. Tell me what you think about this format. Any suggestion for part 2. And yeah, I promise there won't be another 4-month break for my next video. I'm really going to step on the gas pedal and pump up some good stuff. So keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to check out my course, Preparing Before program. You got the link below. Check it out. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.